later on this year. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all and welcome to our hosts, the author Jairus, and what were two discussants. One is Henry Bernstein here, and one is Fahad Ahmad Bishara, hopefully who will join us in time. This is the concluding event of the year for the Centre on Labour and Global Production, which is based at Queen Mary, University of London, and which is very much engaged with the working of capitalism at the global level, at the global scale, and the rich and variegated history of its becoming, which is precisely what Jairus explores in this amazing book. So everyone at the Centre is extremely excited for this event and very grateful to our hosts for accepting our invitation. Liam Campling here is the other co-organizer of this event. So he will be working behind the scenes, managing Zoom, the chat, and the recording of the event. So the event will be recorded and broadcasted. Thanks also to Haymarket Books that will contribute to broadcast this event more widely. And before we start delving into the book, let me spend a few words on our hosts. Jairus Banaji is a research associate with the Department of Development Studies, SOAS, University of London, and he's associated with the Journal of Agrarian Change and Historical Materialism. He has published extensively on the historical working of capitalism. His most recent books include Exploring the Economy of Late Antiquity, Selected Essays, published by Cambridge in 2016, as well as a translation with Rick Kuhn of Henry Grossman Classic Texts on Marx Theory of Crisis, which is forthcoming with Brill. And as many of you know, his book Theory as History is the winner of the 2011 Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize. Henry Bernstein is Professor Emeritus of Development Studies at SOAS, an adjunct professor at the College of Humanities and Development Studies, China Agricultural University in Beijing. He has a long-standing interest in agrarian political economy and social theory. He's a former editor of the Journal of Peasant Studies and a founding editor of the Journal of Agrarian Change. His book, Class Dynamics of Agrarian Change, is a classic, a seminal book on the development and working of capitalism in agrarian settings and beyond. If Fahad joins us, Fahad Ahmad Bishara is Associate Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He specializes in the economic and legal history of the Indian Ocean and Islamic world. He's the author of the book A Sea of Debt, Law and Economic Life in the Western Indian Ocean, 1780 till 1950, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. And the book is a legal history of economic life in the Western Indian Ocean, told through the story of the Arab and Indian settlement and commercialization of East Africa during the 19th century. He's currently working on a connected history of marketplace in the Western Indian Ocean, told from the deck of a 20th century dhow, and drawing on the archives of a number of merchant and dhow captain families from Kuwait. So, we will start with a brief reading of an excerpt from the author. Then we will move from the intervention of Henry at this point and Fahad, if he joins, and we will have a reply from Jairus, a reaction from their comments. After that, we will open to the audience for questions and answers. If you can please keep on being unmuted and raise your hand, Liam will take note of that, and then when he calls your name, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So Jairus, I think you can proceed.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Elena. I suppose I've got 15 minutes for this. Is that right? So I thought I'd just choose two excerpts from the book, which are fairly short. The first one is from the first chapter of the book, which is largely kind of dealing with the historiography of commercial capitalism and why there is so much resistance on the left to accommodating a category of that sort. And the second excerpt comes from a chapter which is essentially about what I call merchant manufacturing, which is basically the Fahad system. And as I said, they're both fairly short excerpts. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah. Okay, so after basically describing the sort of way in which Dobb reacted to Pokrovsky's ideas about merchant capitalism, initially less polemically than he eventually did. And by the 1960s, he was fairly hostile to the idea. I go on to say, with one precocious and brilliant exception, commercial capitalism simply failed to resurface in the English language historiography till the 1980s. Remember, Pokrovsky's kind of recantation, he was forced by Stalin to recant and abandon this theory, is basically dated to the end of the 20s. The exception was Eric Williams, who concluded Capitalism and Slavery with the argument, the commercial capitalism of the 18th century developed the wealth of Europe by means of slavery and monopoly. But in so doing, it helped to create the industrial capitalism of the 19th century, which turned round and destroyed the power of commercial capitalism, slavery, and all its works. Without a grasp of these economic changes, the history of the period is meaningless. That's Eric Williams writing in 1944. In the 80s, in other words, after a gap of almost 40 years, Jeffrey Ingham, John Brewer, and Kane and Hopkins all invoked a notion of mercantile or commercial capitalism as essential to any understanding of modern British history. In Capitalism Divided, 1984, Ingham showed how in the course of the 19th century, the city's commercial capitalism had functioned as a prop for the economy as a whole, and how the country's ruling class survived on, quote, essentially pre-industrial forms of commercial capitalism which have persisted in the city. In The Sinews of Power, which is 1989, Brewer's seminal argument about the nature of the British state began with his own implicit acceptance that, quote, Britain's aggrandizement was impelled by the powerful forces of commercial capitalism. And in British imperialism, Kane and Hopkins were willing to allow for various sorts of commercial capitalism, an indigenous Indian brand of commercial capitalism, advanced forms of commercial capitalism, such as the East India Company and so on, in addition to their own overarching characterization of British capitalism as, quote, gentlemanly capitalism. In contrast to this disjointed evolution was a much tighter tradition of continental historiography, where the major influences were those of the French. Villard, a Marxist, was circumspect, referring only once to European mercantile capitalism in a past and present paper from 1956. But Brodell's Mediterranean and his later work were very largely structured around a vision of commercial capitalism fluctuating between trade, industry, and the money markets. Of a Mediterranean capitalism driven by a few powerful combines, and of industrial capitalism itself, the Fahad system, as largely merchants dominated. To Brodell, long-distance trade was the very lifeblood of commercial capitalism. In his famous essay, La Longue Durée, that's 1958, he suggested that merchant capitalism imparted a certain coherence to a whole 4 or 5 centuries of Europe's economic life, down to the 18th century, and described the expression as, quote, a model that we can disengage from Marx's work. Mounier's own conception of commercial capitalism seemed to stand halfway between Brodell and Tawney, both in underlining the interdependence between the grand commerce capitaliste and the absolutisms of the 16th century, and in seeing Calvinism as exerting a major influence on capitalism, even if capitalism itself predated the Reformation, as Tawney had argued. Now, if we amalgamate these streams of historiography, that's both the continental historiography as well as the British historiography, then every decade since the 60s has produced substantial pieces of work in which commercial capitalism and merchant capitalism are in some way central to their argument. There's Manuel Nunes Diaz's innovative tomes on Portugal's, quote, monarchical capitalism, 1963. Charles Carrier's studies of the trade of Marseille and of the bills of exchange from the 70s. Katharina List and Hugo Solly's monograph on the putting out system, which is 79. The works by Vesara, Peter Pieter, David Ormrod, Bob Shenton, and Joseph Miller in the 80s. Bin Wong's comparative study of European and Chinese economic development, or Leo Nudegraaf's paper on the new draperies, both from 1997, down to more recent work like Sergio Tognetti's monograph on the business groups involved in the silk industry of Florence, or Scott Mahler's study of merchant capitalism in the US South. All of the authors cited above refer explicitly to commercial, merchant, or merchant and banking capitalism. And beyond them lies an even greater mass of writers who refer in passing to mercantile or commercial capitalism and capitalists, and that included E.P. Thompson. So Marxist reticence, that is Perry Anderson, Robert Brenner, and a host of others, is thus strikingly at odds with much of the historiography that has evolved, and it can scarcely invoke orthodoxy when Lenin, for example, admired Pokrovsky's work and would himself use the term private commercial capitalism in the 1918 debates about the organization of Russian industry. Left-wing academics and intellectuals who felt unconstrained by orthodoxies could posit forms of capitalism that Marx himself had never properly discussed. Among the historians listed in the previous paragraphs, only a handful were consciously working in a Marxist tradition. Bob Shenton is probably the best example of this group. A good example of an intellectual, not a historian, who made pointed references to mercantile capitalism is Sartre. In the Critique of Dialectical Reason, he refers to the apparatus and structures of mercantile capitalism in the context of a discussion of Spain's struggle to retain its massive flows of American treasure. Now, one can always say that Sartre is merely summarizing Brodell's argument in Mediterranean, which is true, but the introductory essay, Questions of Method, has Sartre describing the long-standing commercial rivalry between the British and the French as, quote, a secular conflict of mercantile capitalisms, an apt description that stemmed purely from his own reading of history. So if I've got more time, I'll go on to the second excerpt. So that excerpt was from the first chapter, which, as I say, surveys the historiography and emphasizes, underscores the point about why there is so much Marxist reticence in acknowledging or dealing with or discussing or debating merchant capitalism. And the two names actually cited in that context explicitly are Anderson and Brenner. The second excerpt is, as I said, from a chapter on the Verlag system, or what I call merchant manufacturing. Marx's own recurring characterization of commercial capital as inexorably subordinate to industry and to industrial capital obscures the fact that historically a wide range of industries worked for merchants' capital. The chief, but not the only form this took, was what historians writing in English call the putting out system. Hilferding referred to industrial sectors organized in this way as, quote, capitalist domestic industries. Next to large-scale commerce, which Marx was willing to, in one passage, to describe as a form of capitalist production, the capitalist domestic industries were probably the most widespread form of capitalism for centuries together. John Clapham regarded capitalist outwork as, quote, still the predominant form of industrial organization in Britain in the 1820s. When the spinning of cotton began to be mechanized in the last 2 decades of the 18th century, quote, a vast amount of extra weaving capacity was required to work up the vast quantities of machine-spun yarn now being turned out. And this extra capacity, quote, was supplied by an enormous expansion along traditional outwork lines, as a whole new army of men, women, and children were recruited to the handloom. Thus, outwork was not some dying pre-industrial dinosaur, but a perfectly rational, viable, and adaptable form of organization in many industries. It showed remarkable powers of survival throughout the 19th century in the wholesale mass production of cheap ready-made clothing. With the coming of the railways, London wholesale houses in the shirt trade sent their work into the country as well as to the East End. In fact, London remained, quote, the largest single center of outwork production anywhere in Britain in the 19th century. So you have this strange juxtaposition of the city on the one hand as definitive of London's capitalism, and then this massive network of outworkers. Carlo Poni, the Italian economic historian, offered a convenient definition in 1985. Quote, production that was essentially domestic and therefore dispersed was organized and dominated by entrepreneurs who were traders and exported to near and distant markets. In its classic form, the workers, often spinners and weavers who still own their instruments of work, received the raw material from the merchant entrepreneur and were paid by the piece when they handed over the finished product. That's a quote from Poni. He goes on to say, according to Zomba, this cottage industry is already, quote, a manifestation of the modern capitalistic mode of production, the essential characteristic of which was the laborer's dependence on the capitalistic entrepreneur. In German, this dispersed or decentralized form of organization is usually referred to as Verlag, and the merchant deploying it as a Verleger, in English as the putting out system or as outwork or homework, and the merchant as a putter out or just as often as a merchant manufacturer. Capitalist production, in the strict sense, may be said to have begun with the putting out system. The essence of the system was that the subjection of labor to capital occurred in a form that did not presuppose its simultaneous subordination through the labor process. Marx called the latter the real subsumption of labor to capital. It was not embodied in the structure of the labor process or reflected in its technical characteristics. As Marx says repeatedly, at the outset, it, namely capital, takes it, the labor process, as it finds it. It does not therefore directly change the mode of production, where mode of production simply means the labor process itself. On the other hand, and this is crucial, it was essential that the merchant controlled, managed, and coordinated production itself. That is, the interconnected labor processes through which the commodity was finally produced. The dispersal of living labor was retotalized in the final commodity thanks to the merchant's control and integration of production. Poni's definition contains the essential elements of this paradox. The dispersed nature of production, its organization and control by entrepreneurs, who are basically merchants, the merchant's control of the raw material and designs, the widespread use of piece rates, and finally, from Zomba, the subjection of labor, that is, the dependence of the laborer on the capitalist. So that's the end of the second excerpt. I think I've used up my 15 minutes, is that right? Yeah.
Thank you, Jairus. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Henry, do you want to go ahead? Did Fahad arrive?
Fahad has arrived, yes.
Okay. Shall we go with Henry first anyway? Hi, Fahad.
Hello, yes. Yeah, no, go ahead. Go with Henry first, please.
Okay. Henry,
you unmute.
You need to unmute yourself.
Unmuted?
Yes.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
I haven't silenced myself. Okay, well, thanks to Elena and Liam for organizing this event. I'm sorry to go after Fahad now, as he's a professional historian, which I'm not. And thanks to Jairus, of course, for this remarkable book with all its provocations. So this is what I have to say. If you feel I'm running over, Elena, then you must stop me. First of all, I asked myself, what is the book about? Well, we've already had a good introduction from Jairus. It's about the centrality of commercial capitalism from, let's say, the medieval period, 12th century or so onwards. And it's informed by the argument, as Jairus has explained, criticizing stereotypical divisions of capital in circulation and production, and an important manifestation of which is reductions of capitalism to industrial capitalism. So what are the trajectories of Jairus's account? Now, I think it's a very good exercise for anybody reading the book seriously to note the places and times of his different examples. He starts off in the chapter on commercial, I've forgotten I have to look at my book now. Chapter 3, I think, is very key for this. Competition of capitals struggles for commercial dominance from the 12th to 18th centuries. Now, obviously, that's a massive time span, but it's a period or a sequence of periods which are occupied by commercial capitalism in Jairus's formulation of it. It's about the rise and fall of commercial capitalisms, above all centered on international trade. So in a way, it's kind of cosmopolitan, but is also distinguished by the ethnic character and geographical scope of different commercial capitalist groups, their political and military alliances, and their fluctuating strengths and weaknesses. And then towards the end of that chapter, we move towards a period of Dutch dominance or hegemony in world system terms, which then gave rise to British. And I think the experience of British merchant capitalism is actually most central to the development of the argument over time, to its chronologies. Now, I've got a number of, I'm not sure whether they're questions or comments, but I'll say them as I've written them. First of all, a very interesting question, which also connects with some of Jairus's previous work, like his work on late antiquity. Were there commercial capitalisms before the 11th or 12th century, which is roughly their moment of appearance in the book? And are there connections that we may look into between commercial capital and capitalisms and forms and systems of production and states in wider social formations? So I'll come back to this at the end because I think that's very important for Jairus's appendix on Islam and capitalism. As Jairus has explained just now, he says in the book that capitalist production in the sense may be said to have begun with the putting out system. Now, putting out system was characteristic of what Marx called the period of manufacture, and which Marx distinguished from a subsequent period of machinofacture, which is when we get our ideas, possibly stereotypes, of the massive development of the productive forces under industrial capitalism. So for me, in certain ways, industrial capitalism is the sort of the elephant in the room of Jairus's book. If we think of real subsumption of labor, if we think of relative surplus value, if we think of the extraordinary development of the productive forces and so on, these are what we tend to associate with the period of machinofacture. Now, it's not to say that they were absent from periods and forms of manufacture, but they clearly expanded massively when the period of machinofacture commenced. There may be a sort of a hint of this when Jairus talked about merchant manufacturing being dominated by circulating capital. He says the big exceptions to this among putting out systems were mining, iron making, and shipbuilding, all of which involve substantial amounts of fixed capital. And it's interesting because mining, iron making, and shipbuilding were all central to what we conventionally think of as industrial capitalism, i.e. from the late 18th century in Britain, requiring large amounts of fixed capital and being involved in the production of means of production, energy, transport, and so on. And I was sort of struck, although Jairus doesn't mention these other authors, I don't think. I mean, I'm not saying that his book is under-researched, far from it, far from it. But it's interesting because there are other authors in recent years who have seen Industrial Revolution as the key moment in differences between the West and the rest in different ways. So Jack Goody, who emphasized the Industrial Revolution because he also pointed to the dynamism, vitality, diversity of merchant capitalisms before the Industrial Revolution. Janet Abu-Lughod, obviously, in her book, and also in a more roundabout way, Pomerantz in his book on China, The Great Divergence. For him, the Great Divergence starts with the industrialization of Northwest Europe, not before that moment in the late 18th century. It was also kind of interesting to relate Jairus's periodization to some of the world systems people, and not least Giovanni Arrighi, who is possibly or probably the most fertile of them. So Arrighi has a moment of hegemony in world systems associated with Genoa, whereas for Jairus writes much more about Venice, then of the Netherlands, the same as Jairus, and then Britain, the same as Jairus. Now, I've written down a number of quotes from the book that I won't read out now, but which seem to indicate that the transition from merchant capitalism to what one might call modern industrial capitalism is a period from, say, late 18th to early 20th century, during which a number of very important things happen in existing forms of merchant capitalism that Jairus writes about. Now, I'm not going to list them all, but I'm armed with my various quotes in case people are interested. So one example, the temporalities of capital were revolutionized in the third quarter of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, there's an entirely new breed of industrial capital. Capital-intensive, vertically integrated firms would finally emerge to eliminate the old-style merchants by organizing their own sales networks and so on. In other words, the technologies, not least in communications and shipping and so on, railways, that were produced by the Industrial Revolution actually changed some of the basis for the merchant capitalisms of the time. And there's a very striking suggestion in the book by Jairus, which is that imperialism in our usual contemporary sense was a product of the late 19th century. And imperialism included or encompassed the subordination of the merchant capitalisms that exist to the new forces of industrial capital and how they were organized. So I'm going to be disciplined and not read out all my quotes. I can perhaps send them to Jairus in an email. Now, there's a very fascinating aspect of this book, which I think is explicit, but maybe won't be clear enough or full enough to all its readers, which is, given this, the existence of merchant capitalism across so much of Europe and Asia for such a long time, why then did the industrial revolutions occur in Northwest Europe? And here it seems to me that Jairus leans back, let's say, on some aspects of European exceptionalism. Now, he wouldn't call them the genius of Europe like Eurocentric historians do, obviously, but for some reason, which is not entirely clear, in European merchant capitalism, there was a combination of merchant capital with the state, and that was really a crucial factor in driving forward the development of merchant capitalism in Europe or in Northwest Europe to the point where it led, although that was not necessary, it wasn't inevitable, but led to industrial revolution. Whereas Jairus says very specifically in that fascinating appendix on Islam and capitalism, that the decisive factor was the different ways in which capital and the state were bound to each other, something that didn't happen in the Muslim Middle East. He says, if Brodel was correct, the externality of capital to the state remained the chief limitation on Islamic capitalism and its transformative potential. So for whatever reason, and there are similar theses about China and its economic and social development, as Jairus knows. So that was something which seemed to happen uniquely in the merchant capitalisms of Western Europe. And it's a very important point, because without being teleological, without being functionalist about this, it is there in Jairus's book towards the end. It's giving us conditions that were satisfied in Western Europe, in the fusion of or alliance of state and merchant capital, and therefore the use of the state for this incredibly aggressive expansion of merchant capital, which seems to somewhat mark out European history. Okay, I've nearly finished. I don't know how long I've been rabbiting on for, but
you're slightly over time, but you can conclude.
Okay, now I've only got one final sort of point, really, which is about the famous transition debates. Now, clearly, Jairus has succeeded in very important ways in sort of standing them on their head, especially, you know, the classic Brenner position. That's the Brent. Sorry, my doorbell's ringing. I'll just have to go. One moment.
That was about to happen, of course.
just to remind for those people here who have a question, I'm going to be keeping track of those. If you put your name, you type your name in the chat, or you can raise your little hand. In the options. Okay.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm going to finish in a moment.
Nice joke from Simon Joyce.
Yeah, it was. I'm at home alone at the moment, and that was a delivery of firewood, which we don't use, presumably by some local merchant capitalist. Anyway, now the point I was going to make was that what Jairus does, and it's so instructive and provocative and so on, is what he's doing is he's looking at pre-industrial capitalism and later, in effect, industrial capitalism. So pre-industrial capitalism is merchant capitalism. That's what he writes about so well in this little book. But the other common sense of pre-industrial is agrarian. And Jairus, of course, has written a great deal in history and theory about agrarian political economy and its commercialization and so on. But it is striking that the only examples we've got from peasant production, even estate production, is as sources of materials for merchant capital. So I think it would be very nice to see an essay by Jairus which brings in that agrarian aspect, and it's the one that is hammered so much, of course, in the Brenner Wood sort of school of the origins of capitalism, their version of transition. Last question, Jairus: is merchant capitalism a mode of production, or something like a mode of production, which then would characterize much of the economic and social history of Europe and Asia, including Western Asia, from at least the 12th century on? I finished.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you very much. Now it's Fahad's turn. Fahad, I presented you already.
Okay.
You have about the same time.
Sorry, I had to run over here from home. Okay, I'll try to be brief, but I can't promise it. First, I want to thank you all for putting this on, but I especially want to thank Jairus for this fascinating book. And this book really opens up the global in the history of capitalism, and gives us a history of capitalism that is absolutely Braudelian in its sweep. Jairus's framing of commercial capitalism here is supple enough to accommodate a range of commercial practices across time and space, but specific enough that it doesn't become a history of just everything under the sun. And reading this book, I was struck by the breadth of the narrative that Jairus gives us, but also the facility with which he opens up the field to those of us who are working on the non-Western world. And that's what I'm mostly going to be anchoring my thoughts in today. In the US Academy, the literature on the history of capitalism, or at least the sort of the newer variant of the literature on the history of capitalism, is almost exclusively on the Atlantic world. And while I understand why, it leaves those of us working on the rest of the world in the awkward position of having to say, well, we had it too, which is a totally defensible position, of course, but one that's dissatisfying to say the least. So I'm going to pick up on the appendix, which I found incredibly provocative, and try to weave it back through the beginning of the book, not by way of question, but really by way of reflection. What piqued my interest the most were your reflections, Jairus, on the economic history of the Islamic world that were in the appendix. In part, this is because the literature on the topic is highly underdeveloped, I'd have to say, compared to the literature on other parts of the world. We have lots of focused studies on different times and places, but few attempts to really engage with anything large scale, nor anything to nor to write any sort of the history of capitalism of the Islamic world that was anything, that's about anything but how the Islamic world fails to look like the West. And when we do have engagements with the Islamic world, they tend to be of the variant of, see, Muslims had capitalism as well, to which Jairus might answer, well, of course they did, why wouldn't they? But in part, your appendix, Jairus, it piqued my interest because it raised to me the question of what thinking from the Islamic world lets us do in the historiography on global capitalism. There's a tendency to relegate the Islamic world to a particular time period in sort of global economic history, sometimes pre-1258, sometimes pre-1500, but always in the past and in the distant past. And this is just another variant, in my reading at least, it's just another variant of the Muslims had capitalism too argument, but actually a weaker version of it. Oftentimes it's Muslims had it first, which is a sort of a race to the bottom if there ever was one. And yet we know that Muslims are doing business in all sorts of ways across time and space. And Jairus notes this as well. He writes about it in this book, and he signals how, he talks about how Muslims in the period after 1258, after 1500, after the Industrial Revolution, are engaging in business in all sorts of different ways, and posits a relationship between Islam and capitalism that is dynamic, but also but a relationship between Islam and capitalism that Muslims actively think about across time and space. And this is where the appendix was so generative for me, how Jairus highlights many of these thinkers in the appendix, and I found it so sort of delightfully appetizing. And one of the things in sort of a fantasy world, I would love for Jairus to take on the project of thinking about what the history of commercial capitalism would look like from the Islamic world, and whether it would look just like it would from any other part of the world. But to me, this brings up the question of law in all of this. And here I may be violating the cardinal rule of sort of engagement with a book, which is to say, engage with the book that's in front of you, not with the one that isn't in front of you. But in my defense, I'm by inclination a legal historian of economic life. And this just offered so much to think with, because the literature on law and commercial capitalism that we do have mostly comes from a particular persuasion. A lot of the stuff that is most current is of the sort of new institutional economics variant of Douglas North and the Rise of the West, later picked up by historians of the Islamic world like Timur Kuran and others. And whether we take it or not, and there are lots of problems with that literature that one might identify, it does raise an interesting set of questions surrounding the legal underpinnings of commerce. Because throughout this book, throughout Jairus's book, we move between merchants and producers working with different scales of activity and different velocities of circulation. But this activity is, of course, not shorn of law. It's actually fundamentally constituted by it. The relationship between merchants, producers, peasants, these are relationships that are animated by all sorts of different rights and obligations, often articulated in different types of contracts. People and their status in this world of economic activity. This is fundamentally legal. One might think of these as legal persons, legal categories, as well as actual human beings. And the contracts that they enter into are neither monolithic nor unchanging. They're dynamic. Old contractual forms are stretched to meet new circumstances. New contractual forms are generated altogether. And this is to say nothing of a changing world of legal institutions that enforce these. These are all backed by, of course, states, kingdoms, caliphates, emirates, sultanates, empires, trading companies, none of which exist insulated from one another. These are political forms that all bleed into one another in various ways. And then, of course, in a later period, you have nation states as well. The history of commercial capitalism, at least, is thus, in my reading, actually the history of capitalism is, in my reading, a history also of law. And as Katharina Pistor has recently reminded us in her book, it's a terrific book, The Code of Capital, capital is itself coded in law. And if historians have long pointed out, law is the handmaiden of capitalism and thus a critical component of its history. At times, law forms the arena in which different visions of economic life are thrashed out. Whether the law can offer the possibility for truly overturning a system of economic organization is maybe up for debate. But what is beyond question is that the legal arena is where the tensions that capitalism generates often play out. And depending on what school of legal thought one subscribes to, then the relationship between law and capitalism looks different, but it's always there. And this is where the question of Islam and capitalism becomes the most interesting, at least to me. Because as Jairus points out in the appendix, Muslim jurists had long thought about questions of wealth, property, and capital, to say nothing of commerce and production, which they of course spilled enormous amounts of ink on. But they rarely, if ever, thought about these in the abstract. These sorts of questions, we might call them questions of political economy, they were almost always couched in discussions on law. Law was the language through which these discussions took place. Contracts were critical to how jurists understood the marketplace to work. And the very categories which they used to describe wealth, mal, and all of its variations, which Jairus alludes to in the appendix, these are legal categories, not abstract economic categories. If capital in the Islamic world was somehow detached from the state, and I'm not sure it was, there are plenty of examples that might suggest a range of different relationships between states and merchants, but if it was, it certainly was not detached from the law. But thinking about law in Islamic economic history also raises a broad question in the history of global capitalism itself. That is capitalism a single phenomenon that we see replicated across time and space? Or is it always something that, or is it something that is always historically specific, anchored in the particularities of time, place, contract, etc.? And this is the sort of tension between the general and particular is one that historians are never actually able to fully resolve, but it's one that's useful to think with. In thinking through the law, though, we move from a history of commercial capitalism in which everyone is essentially doing the same thing to one in which the contracts, concepts, institutions, practices animating economic life are distinct from one another, even as they are working towards the same end, and even if they're entangled in one another. Now, none of these reflections are meant as challenges to Jairus, but rather the breadth and the scale of the narrative that he presents got me thinking about all of these issues. This is not just a good book, it's a bold book, and one that doesn't shy away from grand narrative. And it's the sort of book and the sort of grand narrative that invites the historian to think broadly. It opens up the historiographical arena enormously and in incredibly generative ways. And for that, I am deeply, deeply grateful to Jairus.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fahad. Very insightful comments from Henry and Fahad. Jairus, do you want to react to these comments briefly before we open to the for questions to the audience? You need to unmute yourself.
Just very briefly, I'll start with Fahad. Thank you for that. That was absolutely fascinating. There's a kind of central argument there, which is that we need to, in some sense, identify the mediations which through which capitalism is articulated in a more general way in particular societies. And I think the whole idea of in the Muslim world of legal discourse and legal practice and legal traditions being in some ways the dominant mediation of capitalism in some broad sense is an absolutely fascinating one. And I think it's the kind of project that he would probably be eminently qualified to actually to pull off. I mean, given his legal background and his grasp of history and economic history, you know, it's the kind of fascinating, ambitious project that I think Fahad himself should maybe try and map out much more and do. So I mean, I'm grateful for that. You know, I mean, it's a dimension which is purely implicit in my own narrative. I know that a lot of the agrarian history that's done in countries like India has actually veered towards a similar kind of awareness of the importance or centrality of law. There's the work that Niladri Bhattacharya has done on the great agrarian expansion of the 19th century. And Niladri has always kind of regarded law as absolutely central to any history of colonialism, and especially any economic history of colonialism. So, you know, what Fahad has said is actually fits very well with this trend within kind of, you know, Indian colonial historiography, which is fairly recent. So Niladri's work on the Punjab is a good example of what he's talking about. So, I mean, I'm grateful for that. I think that's a fascinating point. Again, this brilliant kind of précis that Henry presented of the book, identifying some of its key arguments and themes, is something I'm grateful for to him. I mean, it's basically, you know, the way Henry tends to kind of lucidly sum up the essential aspects of any subject. Of the two kind of major questions that he posed, namely one about the relationship between the mercantile background of European capitalism, which is a background that kind of looms throughout the 19th century, and the emergence of large-scale industry. Let me just say about that I belong with those historians who would now tend to, if there's a major break in terms of the development of industrial capitalism, would tend to put that break somewhere around the 1880s and 1890s, say circa 1900, rather than circa 1800. Now that's partly a matter of which elements or aspects of industrial capitalism really matter. Is it the technologies which are being generated, which is the conventional picture of the Industrial Revolution as a kind of big bang, the invention of steam, and then what Henry called machinofacture and so on and so forth? Or are we dealing with aspects of the relations of production, which is something that Henry refers to when he talks about real subsumption? Because it seems to me that Marx tends to sidestep all those aspects which pull away from his vision or his model of industrial capitalism as essentially involving the subordination of labor to capital within the labor process itself. In other words, there are whole industrial sectors within the British economy in the 19th century which still operate in terms of unmechanized, non-mechanized workplaces, such as the Staffordshire potteries, for example, where employers have no technical means of enforcing control over labor, because these are workplaces which are still largely in the control of workers themselves, particularly if they happen to be craft workers or skilled workers and so on. And therefore, they have to have recourse to legal coercion. For example, criminal prosecutions for breach of contract, which were very widespread in Britain even as late as the 1870s and 1880s, after Marx had actually finished his final draft of Volume 1. You have practices prevailing in Britain which do not entirely bear out the notion of wage labor in Britain at the time being entirely free labor, because workers were subject to these forms of legal coercion. So basically, you're dealing with formal subsumption as late as the 1870s and 80s. The real break, therefore, comes after that. It comes with the emergence of a new kind of industrial capital, which is vertically integrated, very large scale, financed through capital markets or financed through coteries of bankers who are willing to put the money up for these projects and so on. And it's an entirely different kind of capitalist civilization from anything that you would be able to immediately sense from a reading of Volume 1. I mean, in Volume 1, the paradigm industry in some sense is the textile industry. And what Engels is witnessing in the 1880s and 90s is the emergence of those industrial sectors which become typical, characteristic what we regard as modern capitalism or modern industrial capitalism. So that's the first point, that as far as this picture of machino-facture is concerned, it's really kind of a very late 19th century story that we're dealing with. It postdates Capital, and I don't think, you know, we should be reading modern capitalism through volume 1 so much as putting the thing on its head and reading volume 1 through our notions of modern capitalism in the 20th century. And about is merchant capitalism a mode of production? Yes, if mode of production has a historical meaning, namely it defines an entire period of capitalist production and circulation, then yes, I think merchant capitalism is a mode of production in that broad sense. It defines the entire period from, say, the commercial revolution down to its own subordination to large-scale industry and big business, or imperialism or whatever, from the late 19th century onwards. So you have classic markers of merchant capitalism surviving, retaining a certain vitality as late as the 19th century. I mean, I just referred to real subsumption, but there's also, you know, there's also the prevalence of outwork at the very heart of British capitalism. In a city like London, you don't just have the kind of commercial financial nexus and the shipping industry and so on. You also have the prevalence of capitalist domestic industry on a very wide scale. And the city itself is a nexus of commercial capital. And it continues to dominate British economic policy all the way into the 20th century, until its policies are effectively destroyed by the Depression. So about that last point about were there commercial capitalism prior to the 12th century? Well, I mean, you know, the classic terrain of Islam would be an obvious place to look for it. If we're dealing with a kind of coherent, culturally defined commercial capitalism, you know, the Muslim world, which was going through an incredibly vibrant period, all the way from the 8th to the 12th century and so on, would be the obvious place to look for that. And in a scattered way, maybe elsewhere as well. But as far as Western Europe is concerned, it's not until we see the mercantile republics emerging in northern Italy in a big way that we really begin to see a new period of commercial capitalism in a more significant sense. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jairus. I think we have a couple of questions from the chat that Liam picked up before we open to direct questions. Liam, do you want to read them, or?
Yeah, I can read them, but Jairus, while I'm reading, you might want to look at them as well, because they're very specific questions. And the first question is from Harriet Friedman. Hello, Harriet. Lovely to see you here. And the question is, how important... Hi. Do you want to read it out? Shall I go for it?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, while you're here...
You want me to read it?
Well, it's much more interesting than hearing my voice.
Well, I don't know. All right, I have to find it. Yes, I mean, this is a question, I'll frame it, that has to do with the space within which industrial capitalism happened and whether a colonial space is the one we have to see rather than England or Northwest England, sorry. So the question has to do with the raw materials and how important to the transition of putting out system to industrial production was the shift in England from wool and flax, which were regional commodities, to cotton, which was imported. The wool and flax, even if the merchant was providing some, were part of self-provisioning in many cases by the workers, the producers. And cotton had originally been introduced as a luxury product, a fine imported cotton from India. And then the machines were developed specifically to spin and weave cotton. So whether the subsistence and land base, including the raw materials of the workers, is relevant to their slow rather than rapid demise.
Yes, I mean,
Thank you. So Jairus, I'm just going to take one other question, and this was from Morteza Samanpour, and he's asked me to read the question because he has noise in the background, and he says, following Henry Bernstein on the rise of the West, a question for you, Jairus: what are the differences, if any, between the hybrid forms of subsumption, putting out system, domestic industry, in the colonies and the metropoles? If there isn't any difference, then how would you give an account of the underdevelopment in the non-Western societies? And then he gives the example of the book, which I think you know, How the West Came to Rule, and the argument there that the development of waged labour in the West was the result of the development of unwaged labour in the rest. And what's your response to that? And then we have a question from Ben Selwyn, but Chair, should we take those two first and then we'll have Ben come back with the next one?
Let's do 2 questions at a time.
Yeah, I mean, about Harriet's question, yeah, I agree. I mean, I hadn't thought of it in that way, that we can look at the actual commodities that, you know, and the role they play in these transitions. But it seems like an obvious contrast, because you have the, not just the Industrial Revolution in some sense being connected to cotton itself, but then the kind of story that Sven Beckert tells about the emergence of a kind of 19th century world economy, likewise connected to cotton. So obviously the transformation in some ways does have this kind of material basis that you're talking about. I think it illustrates a more general point, which is that, you know, while Marxists are so kind of centered on value and the expansion of value, because that's essentially what capital is, they tend to kind of downplay the importance of use value. All right. And what I mean by downplaying the importance of use value is that there are complex ways in which use value becomes what Marx calls form determining. In other words, determines value production and value relationships. The obvious cases that Marx himself tends to kind of cite are, for example, the way in which the development of transport in the 19th century radically transformed trade itself. You know, now the development of transport is essentially about use values, about the kind of sources of energy which are being used, the modes of transport which are being used, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot. There's a lot in capitalism which we have to trace back to use value in its kind of form determining sense, including things like fixed capital, for example, because, the durability of the machine, which is an example I cited in the book, the durability of the machine determines the turnover of capital. In a physical sense, its depreciation may be something quite different, namely it becomes obsolete as new technologies emerge. But the more durable the machine, the longer the turnover and so on. So yes, about Morteza's point, I'm not completely happy with this term. I know you've used it in both email exchanges and on Facebook and so on, this happy with this term hybrid subsumption. Because as far as I'm concerned, just being completely orthodox here, Marx tends to distinguish between real and formal subsumption of labor. And I'm not sure what it means to talk about hybrid subsumption of labor. I don't know if Morteza's there still. What would it mean to talk about hybrid subsumption? Does it simply mean that capital is using typically or quintessentially pre-capitalist forms of exploitation, for example? Is that what it means? That there's this kind of mixture that Rosa Luxemburg talks about, in the case of, with reference to South Africa and so on, the forms of labor bondage that can be used in gold mining, so that you have powerful capitalist monopolies on one side, and then you have the compounding of labor on the other side, subject to all manner of coercions, racialized capitalism, etc. I'm not happy with the term hybrid subsumption of labor, because I think it's mixing up different levels of abstraction. I can understand the distinction between real and formal subsumption, and there are passages in Marx where even that distinction becomes nebulous, in the sense that he talks about transitions, transitional forms, and so on and so forth, especially when he's trying to figure out what's happening in the Indian countryside with debt relations. Usually he refers to the classic Indian moneylender of the 19th century as a capitalist. But he's not never entirely sure whether we should categorize this as formal subsumption of labor or not. So yeah, that's my general response to that.
Thank you. We have a question from Ben now.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Elena and Liam, for organising this, and thanks to Jairus and everyone else for participating. Amazing. It's great to see you all, especially in these terrible times of social distancing. So I'll just read out my question, which is quite short, and then maybe I'll contextualise it a little bit to explain why I'm asking it. So my question is, how different is Jairus's account of commercial capitalism from Marxist analysis of primitive accumulation? Or more provocatively, what did Marx miss out in that account? And did Marx provide a better account or fragments of an account elsewhere? Because I know that Jairus uses a Grundrisse and other places in your writings sometimes. But the reason I ask that question is because when I read that section on primitive accumulation, it's about, I don't know, 80, 90 pages, something like that. You know, each chapter I recognise the strands of different Marxist traditions now. So, you know, the one about the dispossession of the peasantry, there's Brenner and Wood. Then the stuff about the kind of expropriation in Latin America and Africa, well, there's world systems theory. Then there's the kind of forcing down of the factory wages. I think it's operaismo and various kind of much more hard kind of the role of the state in kind of creating the capital labor relation. And in my kind of non-historian's mind, kind of quite simply, I see, you know, Marx basically had it all there. And then all of the different historical traditions of Marxism have taken one section, one slice of the pie, and then expanded that and said, no, we have got everything here. So in a sense, that's just a kind of contextualizing my question to Jairus. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. There's a question from Pritan Singh. You need to unmute yourself, sorry. We can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I would prefer to ask the question after Jairus has replied to Ben, because my question is very different from Ben's. But if you insist that there have to be two questions, I'm happy to ask.
Okay, Jairus, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredibly interesting way of reading the various Ben, yeah? An incredibly interesting way of reading the various chapters on primitive accumulation. I hadn't thought of it like that, in the sense of each chapter offers a perspective which can be expanded into an entire theory and a school of Marxism and so on. The one that's always commanded my particular interest and attention is chapter 31, because that is the chapter in which I think Marx comes closest to identifying a role for the state. You know, other than the fairly obvious point that that the enclosure movement largely depended on legal interventions by the state and so on. It's, you know, if one wants a kind of a synthesis or a kind of general global picture of what's taking place, something that's unified, you'll find it in chapter 31 when he talks about the different moments of primitive accumulation, right? And then he lists them almost like a narrative of capitalism, but it's an incredibly condensed paragraph. And he refers there to, for example, to the commercial wars, you know, between these different nations. But those nations are fairly recent entities. I mean, when, you know, by the time those wars were being fought out in the 17th and 18th centuries, those nations didn't have a prior existence of more than, say, 2 centuries. They were relatively inchoate. All of them were kind of in some ways presided over by absolutisms of one type or another. But, you know, the listing of these moments of primitive accumulation is almost like Marx saying, I could write a whole book about this. You know, if I were to look at the history of capitalism, this is the passage or the paragraph that I would expand into a kind of coherent history of capitalism. Because let's just be clear about this point about the dispossession of labor, that the bulk of abstract labor that was being coerced or performed even as late as the late 19th century worldwide, so to speak, i.e. living labor as a source of value production or of capital production, was not dispossessed in any formal sense, right? If you look at the kind of working classes worldwide, as a source of surplus value production and capital value production. They weren't kind of workers who had been completely dispossessed from the means of production. So emphasizing that inordinately, is in some sense like falling into a teleology of capital and ignoring the fact that in most parts of the world, workers had not formally at least been divorced from their means of production. On the contrary, the combination, the unity of labor and those means of production, domestic means of production, was essential to accumulation, to capitalist accumulation. All right. Unless they were going to have plantations, for example, all right, and generally the catchment area for labor in plantations was never local. Locals always resisted work in plantations, so they had to import labor from places like Chota Nagpur and other parts of India in order to get the tea plantations going, because the local Assamese wouldn't work on the tea plantations. It wasn't that easy. It wasn't that easy for them to actually operate plantation industries, given the persistent problems that they had with the recruitment of labor. On the other hand, industries like jute were based entirely on small peasant holdings, all right, and not necessarily subject to any obvious or explicit forms of coercion. It's just that as long as peasant households were integrated into the market and became increasingly dependent on cash crop production and had to finance their purchase of food later in the year by their production of cash crops, then that mechanism worked in some sense almost automatically. You didn't have to have moneylenders saying, look, I'm going to give you an advance, but I need the jute in return. That's not how it worked. It's just the very process of integration into the market acted as a silent compulsion on peasant households and peasant labor throughout, for example, the Bengal Delta. So I don't think we should exaggerate the point about the dispossession of labor. It is not even a West European story so much as a British story, right? It's British capitalism which ruthlessly dispossesses labor, drives it off the land more than even like continental capitalism. We still have a substantial peasantry in Germany under the Prussian Junkers. There's no point in exaggerating. When Marx encounters this in France, when he encounters a small-holding peasantry that still survives in the 19th century, he's not entirely able to kind of integrate them into a picture of the world beyond describing them as a sack of potatoes. If it's peasants who are behind the farmers' struggles in India today, namely the Punjab farmers' struggles, then it's certainly not a sack of potatoes.
Thank you. Pritam Singh, do you want to pose your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers who organized this wonderful discussion. And of course, for Jairus to come over and congratulations on this wonderful book. And to Henry, I might say, for a very good, and Jairus has already thanked him for the precise summary and new questions which he has raised. One or two points which I thought was really remarkable, which Jairus has made and which also has an echo in Henry. Jairus made this point as a method that we should not read we should read capital from the modern viewpoint rather than trying to deduce the modern viewpoint from what capital says. I think I agree with that. But I would extend that to also saying that we should also look from a contemporary angle all the other works on capitalism which are being done now. It's not only Marx's work, but other historical works, including Jairus's, from a modern perspective. And also, I think Jairus has also made another very good point about the importance of use value and overemphasis on exchange value in most Marxist works. And I think he's very right in Capital Chapter 1 itself. Marx deduces value from use value and then goes on to exchange value. So I think use value is again very important. Henry, I think, was very good in posing this contradiction between, not contradiction, but counterposing commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism, and how in Marxist views, how industrial capitalism is seen as progressive because it leads to technological change and development of productive forces and the modern working class and so on and so forth. So in the light of that, my question or comment would be that in modern capitalism, one can't really disentangle commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism. They're so entangled with each other. One can't say that this is commercial capitalism and this is industrial capitalism. Okay? And Jairus mentioned about this farmer struggle on which I have been writing in the last few days. Actually, illustrates that point that if Adanis are going with massive trading project in Punjab and Haryana, it's not simply commercial and trading capitalism, it's also industrial capitalism. The question I have is, when I look from an ecological perspective, that's what I meant by contemporary perspective. That to me, neither commercial capitalism nor industrial capitalism offer any hope from a different angle, that both are ecologically destroying in different ways. Commercial capitalism is destructive of nature and the planet because of the emphasis on transportation. And the transportation is everywhere polluting and damaging to the environment. Industrial capitalism, which is based on extraction of surplus value and accumulation of capital, also uses nature in an exploitative manner. So from this, to me, it looks like that the theory of historical materialism, to which we all used to, which was obliquely referred to by Henry, that we look upon, and Marx also had the same idea, we look upon progress in this direction. That are we moving towards industrial capitalism? Are we moving towards a large-scale production? Working class is being born out of it, which is a revolutionary agent to bring about the socialist revolution. I have to still write about it. These are initial thoughts. I think that in many ways, pre-capitalism, from an ecological point of view, was historically more progressive than capitalism, which doesn't mean that capitalism is not more progressive than pre-capitalism in many other ways. Democracy, gender rights, and all those things. But from the viewpoint of ecological destruction, capitalism is far more destructive than any pre-capitalist mode of production. So that's where I would want to end that. This question, I would kind of pay respect to Jairus that his book has made me think more about this. That we need to think about our traditional views of historical materialism, of one superior mode of production, overtaking the earlier mode of production and being progressive, teleological way of looking at it. And so that's where I will end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got another one from Gavin. Gavin Capps. Are you there?
I am. I'm just trying to unmute. Just one second.
You are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, this is just to understand what's being argued a little bit better. So I suppose it's a question of clarification, really, Jairus. So when for you exactly do the concepts of capitalism, as in the concepts that are specific to the capitalist mode of production, as formulated by Marx, that suite of concepts like value, surplus value, abstract labor, etc. When and under what conditions actually do these concepts attain their historical validity? Or to put it another way, as maybe you might put it, perhaps not, but as I think you might put it, when does wage labour in all of its possible concrete forms, whether subject to the real or formal subsumption to capital, actually become abstract value producing labour, or capital positing capital producing labour? Are these concepts, surplus value, abstract labour, etc., are these exclusively the concepts of industrial capitalism, which could either be dated from the turn or the end of the 19th century, depending how we want to go with that, and which could include both elements of formal and real subsumption of labour? Or are these concepts which pertain also in some way to this period of commercial capitalism, which may possibly stretch back all the way to the 12th century? Was there actually abstract value producing labour in certain parts of the world in the 12th century, and if so, how? That's my question.
Thank you, Gavin. Jairus?
Yeah, I mean, responding to Preetham, I think I actually read a text which asked about Liechtenstein's work on, the return of merchant capitalism. I think, Preetham, you asked me that, didn't you? And I agree with, I think this guy, Nelson Liechtenstein, studied Walmart and saw it as a good example of merchant capitalism. He drew parallels between the late 20th century and kind of the big joint stock companies, East India Company, and so on and so forth. Essentially, what he was talking about was modern forms of capitalism, seeing the drive to organize supply chains, but now on in a much more structured way. He correlated that with the devastation of industry in the US itself, the fact that millions of jobs were being lost in the last quarter of the 20th century in the US, thus preparing the ground for Trump, of course, because that is the kind of material basis on which Trump emerges and allows his own kind of rhetoric to then sound convincing to people 15 or whatever years down the line. But millions of jobs were lost as a result of the fact that Walmart, as a giant retailer, switched its outsourcing from domestic manufacturing units, small-scale domestic manufacturing units, and so on, to China. So China became the main supplier of the goods that would end up on the shelves in Walmart establishments. And I think that's a brilliant article by Lichtenstein about, freedom, about the points about before capitalism, after capitalism, and so on. I suggest we look at it less in terms of chronology and more in terms of communities which struggle to retain some sense of control over the way the land is managed, for example, or over the way that resources are managed. Because while both commercial and industrial capitalism obviously have this kind of massive effects on the environment and on nature and so on, I think it's with the emergence of kind of carbon capitalism in the early 19th century, if you like, isn't that Al-Fatah's term, carbon capitalism or whatever. It's with the emergence of this kind of industrial capitalism that we see the real devastation of the environment taking place. I don't think merchant capital compares in any way, even though it sort of vitally depends on transport. Even those means of transport are being produced by early forms of industrial capital, as in the shipbuilding yards and so on. So rather than seeing it as pre-capitalist, commercial capitalist, industrial capitalist, and so on, it seems to me to try and identify struggles that communities in the capitalist era, broadly speaking, from the 11th, 12th century onwards, the kind of struggles that they have waged in order to retain control over their immediate environment, over the management of that environment, and so on. I mean, I'm not aware of any book that has actually done this, that has documented this historically, but I would have thought that's what we should be looking at, namely the resistance to capital in terms of some kind of, if you like, spontaneous ecological rationality or embedded ecological rationality that either peasant communities or farming communities of various sorts, grew up with, so to speak. So that's the sense. The Gavin's point about when does abstract labor start? I think, obviously once competition between capitals takes a purely economic form, that is to say, it's competition in terms of the productivity of labor, in terms of the prices at which commodities are being sold, that we can talk about abstract labor in its fully developed sense, right? That I would have thought is something that increasingly begins to take place from maybe the 17th and 18th centuries onwards. But as with any sensible history of capitalism, we shouldn't try and be too precise about, precisely when does this appear or precisely when does that appear. The important thing is that we're dealing with what Sartre calls a kind of totalization, right? And by its very nature, the very logic of totalization, it's hard to actually pin down these things and say, this is when something happens, this is when something emerges. Engels grapples with precisely this question that you raised in his addenda to volume 3 of Capital, which he wrote very late in the 1890s, shortly before he died. He precisely identifies these big commercial establishments and then tries to identify the way in which competition develops, in stages Initially, it's competition within a national establishment, like the Venetian traders competing with each other, but internally, so to speak. And then it's between these various national establishments, the fondaci, which are settled in various merchant colonies in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then, of course, at an even higher stage, it's between entire national blocks of capital, the Portuguese versus the Venetians, the Dutch against the Portuguese, and then the British and the Dutch, and so on and so forth. You can see this kind of price competition occurring in a very vigorous way with the French drive to capture the textile markets in the Ottoman Empire, sort of defeating both the Dutch and the English at that stage, driving them out so that the entire 18th century is dominated by French merchant capitalists, at least as far as the Levant is concerned. You can see this is a process of price competition. But on the other hand, labor is not being aggregated into unified workplaces. It remains dispersed. It remains household labor, except to the degree that you have more centralized Verlag systems in the Netherlands. You have entire kind of textile centers churning out this stuff. The French textile industry in the west of France is certainly not organized on that basis. It's organized essentially as a kind of putting out system. Powerful merchants and a mass of impoverished, dispersed households in the countryside who have not enough land to survive on, and therefore they're forced to turn to artisan occupations of various sorts, predominantly textiles. On the other hand, that doesn't stop the merchants from actually exporting this stuff all the way across the Atlantic. So you have very large-scale exports taking place, but the countrysides that are being sourced by these merchants are impoverished countrysides which can't be sustained purely through agriculture. Price competition is when you can talk about abstract labor. If it's competition in terms of the productivity of labor, that's the classical kind of picture that Marx is talking about. But that doesn't mean that we don't have wage labor much earlier than that. The degradation of laborers into wage laborers much earlier than that, or capitalist exploitation of household labor much earlier than that, or even kind of very powerful capitalist syndicates and networks, such as you have in Central Europe, in southern Germany, these huge combines that German capital organizes, using Verlag in a very wide range of industrial sectors, including mining. So that would be my answer, that if you're looking for a transition to abstract labor in Marx's sense, it's beginning to happen in the 17th and 18th centuries in sectors like textiles.
Thank you. So we have now two further questions from Nick Evans and Alessandra Mezzadri. Nick?
Hi, thank you, and thank you for writing this wonderful book. In a sense, my question you've started to answer when you're answering Pritan's question, which was about class struggle and the way in which do you see commercial capitalism as structuring class struggle in specific ways? I suppose the sheer variety makes it hard to answer that question, but I was struck one of the places where you do talk about class struggle, you talk about the Chompy revolt, and striking the group that you say is evolved is actually the people who are directly subordinated within households, and not the people, in a sense, within this Verlag system. So that was one part of the question. So the other was, I suppose, then thinking about transport. You were talking about, you mentioned in response to, I think, to Harriet's question, was it, that transport radically transforms trade, ways in which transport, I mean, I suppose thinking about transport workers and sailors, I mean, do the forms of labour subjection that are involved in transport, how does that figure within this model?
Thank you. Ale?
Hi, thank you. I feel a bit bad because I'm actually asking a question on Jairus' answer to a question, which I'm not sure is fair enough, but I hope at least it will be interesting enough in relation to some of the major themes that are addressed in the book. So I was very surprised, Jairus, that you answer Henry's question in relation to commercial capitalism being seen possibly as a mode of production in an affirmative way. Because as I read your work, and at least also how I find it extremely useful, is to challenge stagist and nationally bounded idea of what capitalism is, so that you get rid of this idea of transition, or like, you know, you liberate yourself from this Marxist original sin to have to deal with where is it that we're going to see certain things if eventually emerging. Well, instead, if we understand this as a mode of production, I would say there is less of a weakening of the concept of transition that we would have otherwise. So I was actually interested in knowing why you answered positively and in which way to that question. Because in my understanding, instead, if we take, that is what I get from your book, that you just able to picture global history of capitalism, which has meant different things also in different parts of the world, and it has manifested itself in different forms of exploitation and in different ways in which assumption, real and formal, as manifested in a way that is cohesive for all of us under this capitalist life as it was yesterday and as it is today. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Jairus, after your answer, we will have a last round of questions. There's another question from Harriet Friedman. No, yes, and Faisal. And then we will also give the opportunity to Henry and Fahad to have any comments, if any final comments, if they want.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, about the, you know, among these two questions, the first one is about class struggle. Again, what this book was trying to do was, in some sense, you know, it's a very preliminary mapping of what Feyerabend, the philosopher of science, called a scientific research program, right? To me, historical materialism, if it has any functionality, if it makes any real sense in a practical way for young historians, for example, has to be a kind of collection and an ensemble of scientific research programs, right? We haven't even reached the stage of identifying any of these programs, but we're so obsessed with, you know, a lot of past debates. And I mean, the classic example of this is the Brenner debate. It seems to me that kind of ran out of energy at some stage, and yet there's an entire tendency that identifies itself as political Marxism or political Marxist, resting on the kind of quote unquote achievements or the outcome of Brenner's own kind of interventions in that, or Wood's interventions in that. It seems to me that's not the way that historians should be practicing historical materialism. They should be trying to develop scientific research programs which are manageable and workable, and identifying the interesting ones. And it seems to me your remarks about class struggle and merchants' capital is a good example of what would constitute a fruitful, a kind of fertile kind of, you know, candidate for a scientific research program. Because reading Tessie Liu's work on the kind of, you know, the putting out system in the west of France, in the northwest of France, it seems to me that what you had is a tenacious struggle between workers working under this system on the one hand, especially weavers, and the putting out capitalists who had to, you know, devise ways and means of subjugating labor. And the best way they could think of doing that was to monopolize the yarn, all right? To establish a kind of yarn monopoly so that workers wouldn't have any other recourse other than having to depend on these merchants for the supply of yarn. I mean, it's a brilliant book. It's called The Weaver's Knot. And I think the whole thing is a classic illustration of class struggle, you know, in a very conventional, fairly orthodox sense of class struggle. But it's a perfect example of how you can have workers struggling in this way against a class of merchant capitalists. But it's highly localized, of course. It's a local story. It belongs to this particular part of France. It can't be generalized and so on and so forth, because we're not dealing with those workers as part of some kind of, you know, national class of workers at this stage. So that would be an example. And secondly, about the workers who are actually involved in the circulation industry, those means of production that are kind of, you know, within circulation, so to speak, such as kind of the maritime industry and maritime sectors of capitalism. In a paper that I wrote after the book, which is called State and Capital in the Era of Primitive Accumulation, it's available on my academia page, right? It was a lecture I presented in Amsterdam in 2019. What I've tried to do is identify in a rather schematic way broad sectors of merchant capitalism, right? And one of these is the shipping industry, because it seems before the complete professionalization of shipping, which takes place from the late 18th century onwards, when you have a separate group of powerful capitalists who specialize in owning ships and in running ships and operating ships. Before that, there was much more integration between the merchant and the ship owner. There was an integration between these sectors of capital prior to that kind of specialization that takes place. So that for centuries together, it seems to me, one would have been able to see maritime logistics as a sector of merchant capitalism rather than something external to it. And that, of course, ties up with shipbuilding. There's this brilliant study, I forget by whom, of the Venetian shipbuilding industry, where you see all the classic features of industrial capitalism, contained within the huge Venetian shipyards, which are churning out, batches of different kinds of vessels year after year, but organized by the state. And I think, I forget the name of the author, but he actually calls it state capitalism. It's one of Europe's earliest forms of state capitalism, because it's the state that emerges as the collective capitalist, organizing labor and regimenting labor to an essentially industrial regime. So it's almost like the real subsumption of labor occurring, but under the patronage of the state. That in turn, the market for that is, of course, merchant capital, right? So mercantile capitalism, if you like, can be divided up into these sectors, and it seems to me that everything, all maritime labor, everything connected with that, whether it's the longshoremen, it's the dock workers and so on, or the people actually staffing the ships and so on, can all be integrated into this as a kind of general category. Now, Alessandra, I was trying to say that if we retain the term mode of production in a broad historical sense, to distinguish it from other modes of production, i.e. other historical epochs, like slavery, feudalism, and so on and so forth, all right, then it seems to me that we would have to acknowledge that the kind of capitalism we're dealing with in this mode of production is not quintessentially industrial, but it's commercial. So I wasn't kind of suggesting a kind of stages theory of any sort. I was simply saying that if we choose to retain the idea of a mode of production as a kind of characterization of an entire epoch, then yes, there's a sense in which commercial capitalism or merchant capitalism should be seen as a mode of production. Now, you can always retreat from that position to the one that Brodel took, which was simply to say everything from the 14th to the 18th century is merchant capitalism, right? Which is what his which is the position he takes in that famous essay on the longue durée. That if you want a characterization which is coherent, which ties together these various centuries, then merchant capitalism seems like the best one to have. That doesn't say anything about mode of production or whatever, because Brodel wasn't a Marxist, although he did say that we can actually extrapolate this category out of Marx's work to the extent that we're using a notion of capitalism itself. But he didn't feel obliged or compelled in any way to endorse an idea of mode of production as a kind of necessary vision of the entire period. All I'm saying is that if we're going to be pietistic Marxists or loyal Marxists or church-going Marxists and retain an idea of mode of production, okay, then these centuries are best seen as centuries dominated by merchant capital. Incidentally, when Preobrazhensky deals with primitive accumulation in the new economics, it's merchant's capital which is the key actor in the process of primitive accumulation. And for him, the main form of primitive accumulation is what he calls the plundering of petty commodity production. All right, that from Preobrazhensky is the key form that primitive accumulation takes. In other words, merchants plundering petty commodity producers. Now that, it seems to me, raises the problem of what does it mean in Marxist terms to talk about the plundering of petty commodity production. And it seems to me that we are therefore forced to take Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange more seriously, all right? Because if that concept is to make any sense in Marxist terms, it's referring to transfers of value out of the sector of petty commodity production into the sector of capitalist accumulation through some mechanism which Emmanuel himself identifies as unequal exchange. where you have mobility of capital, immobility of labor, and therefore very different rates of surplus value prevailing worldwide, then you have unequal exchange. And that's exactly the picture of the joint stock companies. You have these large, well-organized companies backed by the state, moving into parts of the world they've never been to before, therefore enhanced mobility of capital, but of course exploiting resources which are entirely localized and which have no chance of moving around. Right, so it's a perfect fit for Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange. In other words, if you take Preobrazhensky's image of the merchant plundering the petty commodity producer, then if you like, the Marxist substance of that is given in the notion of unequal exchange.
Thank you. So I'm conscious that we're running late, and it's also very late in the evening for Jairus. I'll have a last round of questions. If you can keep it short, please. Harriet Friedman, please. You need to unmute your. Yeah.
Keep it very short. Jairus, thanks for all this. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Haven't yet. I'm curious if you have anything to say about finance and debt in relation to all of this, either early debt, but even things like the transition out of slavery in the US into what was called debt peonage, or the pervasiveness of debt and credit now into consumer culture even, or Arrighi's idea of finance as the mechanism by which places are shifted, or capitalist sectors are shifted.
Thank you. Faisal Hamada.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Jairus, and thank you all the comrades for the questions and the organization. And this is a question I've always wanted to ask you, Jairus, is that Sartre's critique of dialectical reason plays a very big part in your thinking. So you use it to discuss free labor and unfree labor. You talk about seriality in your discussions of fascism, and the concept of totalization seems to be very informative for you. But it seems that this book is very ignored in much of contemporary Marxist thinking. So could you maybe tell us what the book might teach us that other kinds of approaches to history do not?
Thank you. And there's maybe a last quick question from Sebastian Rio. Would you like to do that?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the organization. Thanks, Jairus, for your time. Two quick questions. In the book, you make a very good and quick reminder about the etymology of the word factory. And you say that the factory, I would say probably from late 14, early 15 up to well into the 18th century, factory was referred to a trading post and even a district in a foreign country where factors were conducting business. And it seems to me that the evolution of the meaning of the word exemplifies a little bit the transition from commercial to industrial capitalism. So factor as an agent of circulation and factory as a trading establishment to a factor as an agent of production and factory as a production site. So I wanted to maybe to know if you could expand a tiny bit more on that. And the second quick question is the rise of financialization over the last few decades. Is it a return of some form of commercial capitalism? Like big businesses like Apple or Nike are not involved in the organized production, a bit like big merchant houses would have done many centuries ago. But they are not necessarily involved in the production process itself. So I just wanted to know a bit more about what did you think about that, and if we're moving. Yeah.
Could I just ask what did you just say about the rise of what? I didn't catch that. Rise of what?
Finance and the role of finance capital is, right. and the fact that big global firms are now able to actually subcontract pretty much most of their production. So a new commercial capitalism or not? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, shall I just respond briefly? I think
Yes.
that last point to some degree ties up with the question that Harriet raised. Remember, when one is talking about European merchant capitalism in its kind of classic period from the 16th to the 18th centuries, let's say, the kind of finance that we're talking about here is what in French they call haute finance, right? This is really big players in substantial money markets, which are handling phenomenal sums of capital on a daily basis and transacting across the continent. That's across at least most of Western Europe. So, you know, it's again, going back to this idea of being able to break merchant capitalism down into manageable sectors. The money market would be a crucial sector of merchant capitalism. And that is where finance comes in a big way. I think that's the kind of finance that Arrighi is talking about. You know, at least if he's talking about Genoa and the dominance of the Genoese, then that's the kind of finance that we're dealing with. Not so much debt at the level of labor and the attempt to tie labor down and so on. So, you know, this is a fairly messy area conceptually, because you can ask all kinds, just as with shipping and shipbuilding and so on, are those part of commercial capitalism? Are they not part of commercial capitalism? Where do the boundaries lie? Do the same capitalists actually operate in both spheres? What degree of integration is there between these sectors? How much synergy is there between them and so on? Just as you can raise a whole lot of questions with respect to shipping, the same holds for finance. In other words, you know, where are the boundaries between, you know, merchants' capital on the one hand and financial capitalists or big financiers on the other? And again, the answer is that it's necessarily fluid. There's a great deal of overlap and integration between these things. The most powerful capitalists went into finance. That's, if you like, you can see it like a pyramid differentiated by levels of power. The most powerful capitalists would deal with lending to the state. And these are states which had an inordinate appetite for finance because they had to finance wars, right? So much of this finance is war finance. That's where the money was being made by the really powerful syndicates and groups in Northern and Western Europe at the time. I don't know if that answers your question, but going back to, just sort of skipping the point about the question about Sartre for the moment, going back to Sebastian's point about finance, it seems to me that, you know, we can visualize the bulk of the 20th century as a period when capitalism was essentially being organized in terms of mass production, what people call Fordism and so on, and everything that implied in terms of the organization and control of the labor process, and also in terms of unionism and cultures of unionism, because you had mass unionism emerging in the 20s and 30s directly as a kind of offshoot of the introduction of mass production from, let's say, from the First World War onwards. Now, that period, that type of capitalism, that period of capitalism seems to run into severe problems by the 1960s and 70s. And then we begin to see this transition to a completely different political economy of capital, which dominates the last quarter of the 20th century, which is where you have this explosion of the financial market, starting with, you know, Reagan taking over the presidency. The bond markets just go into an absolute tizzy in the early 80s, right? American finance capital in this new late 20th century emerges as a major economic sector from that period. And simultaneously with that, you begin to see interesting shifts in the balance of power between retail capital and manufacturing capital. All right, so when manufacturers have to start competing for scarce shelf space, retailers are able to charge them an extra premium for, you know, if they want their products actually advertised on the shelves. I forget what it's called. It's some kind of allowance, right? It's some kind of allowance which is being charged to manufacturers by retailers.
Slotting allowance.
Sorry? Yeah. Anyway, then you begin to see these giant retailers emerging to dominate much of this new period of post-Fordist capitalism from the 80s onwards. So on the one hand, you have a lot of capital being sucked into the financial markets as if there is an over-accumulation of capital, of manufacturing capital. And on the other hand, you begin to see industrial firms in the West breaking up large plants, whatever the diseconomies of small scale and so on, breaking up large plants in order to avoid concentrating workers, in order to break the combativity of well-organized workforces, and subcontracting extensively, both within countries like India, all the companies which have industrial production going on in centers like Bombay just break up their plants and outsource extensively or subcontract extensively, and also internationally, of course, so that much of this production is being shifted to places like South Korea and the Far East and so on. So all kinds of major structural changes are occurring towards the end of the 20th century, which have implications for employment levels, and also, of course, therefore, for the way in which wage earners are forced to be, are forced into debt, into consumer debt, in order to sustain living standards through a period which involves concerted attacks on their living standards, a deunionization of the labor market, etc., etc. So these things are, in some sense, they're all tied up with each other, or they're kind of interdependent in that way. So yeah, I don't know whether you would now still want to retain the term merchant capitalism in its classic sense to characterize what's happening in the late 20th century. Certainly the giant retailers are perfect examples of the return of merchant capitalism, but that's not good enough as a characterization of the entire kind of capitalism, type of capitalism that's emerging in this period, which begins to see globalization of productive capital, in the sense that productive capital is being dispersed globally. You have new industrial centers, new manufacturing centers emerging in the Far East. And all kinds of processes are occurring which are replicated in markets like India, where you have firms breaking up large-scale production, subcontracting extensively in order to avoid what they regard as high-wage islands. Now, the one point I'd like to make in all this is that if you read the Communist Manifesto, it's an extremely optimistic picture of the world. Why? Because Marx completely discounts managerial decision-making. It is not a moment that enters into his picture of capital. And that, to a large extent, also carries over into capital itself. But the Communist Manifesto paints a picture of the world where workers are being increasingly employed in larger and larger workplaces, and they're being trained by the labor process itself. All right. So there's this kind of spontaneous process of the self-education of the class taking place. They're becoming better organized, becoming larger, and they're learning through the labor process itself and through struggle within it. That is certainly not the picture that one sees after the 1960s. And the one conclusion capital drew from the great upsurge, the radicalism of the 1960s, was not to have large workplaces. All right. I mean, that's essentially, in places like Italy, we see them reacting ever so sharply to the kind of combativity that was displayed in the northern industrial centers. So that a new period begins to emerge, which is also a reflection of new corporate strategies, where they are not willing to be confronted with very large workplaces. In fact, the only substantial challenges that I can see labor mounting as late as the 90s is in places like South Korea, in these huge shipyards, where the workers are just congregated together in thousands and thousands. That is the picture of the manifesto. All right. It still exists there, so to speak. But by and large, through most of the world, capital has moved away from that model. There are diseconomies of large scale, so to speak. At least class struggle entails diseconomies of large scale, and therefore they break up production processes. And then, of course, you have the whole technological revolution of the late 20th century, which enables that to happen, without which it wouldn't be possible to disperse production into these kind of networked production forms that are occurring. So the big car manufacturers, for example, are going into very complicated ways of running the industry, which no longer depend on physical sites of production being concentrated. Now, the last question about Sartre, I think Sartre is the only Marxist who tries to seriously addresses the issue of how do you integrate the moment of consciousness of human activity with the moment of structure, of inertia. How do you integrate these two levels into a coherent account of history, so that neither one nor the other is left out, obliterated, lost, so to speak, or subordinated to the other. He tries to retain the kind of tension between praxis and the practical inert, between the things that we do as the conscious makers of history, so to speak, on the one hand, and the huge, enormous, powerful, anonymous forces that govern our lives on the other, which he calls practical inert, because the defining feature of all that is inertia, is the resistance to change, the resistance to intervention, the resistance to praxis, and the ability to actually steal your praxis, to steal the meaning of your praxis by giving it a different kind of meaning. So that's the fascination of the critique of dialectical reason, that he holds these two moments together in a kind of tension and builds, an increasingly complex dialectic between them as you move through the pages of the critique.
Thank you. Fahad and Henry, do you have a last comment to make, or?
I had noted that he had to step out because he's got a meeting that starts now.
Ah, okay. So Henry.
Can Henry hear?
Yep. All I will do is report my usual condition of massive overstimulation from being engaged in discussion with Jairus and hearing his views on a range of topics, not just the topics of the book. And that will keep me going for a few months, trying to get hold of all that, at least a few months until we get a chance to do this again, Jairus. Just something that occurred to me at the end, especially in the light of some of the more theoretical, quote unquote, questions you got, like from Gavin Capps, is it struck me, and I don't know if there's any other way a historian can do this, how incredibly sociological your account is in the book on commercial capitalism. It focuses so clearly on firms, on families, on individuals, on, particularities of time and place, not least cultural particularities. I'm not saying that's not important, but I think there's still some interesting issues about connecting all that with the more sort of the theoretical apparatus that we tend to operate with, at least some of the time. And I know, apropos your last remarks, your enormous regard for Sartre in trying to move towards grasping some of these issues and the tensions they generate. But I'd also like to congratulate Elena and Liam. I think it's been a superb event, and I'm sure Jairus would agree with that.
Okay.
I hope so. You don't have to agree.
No, and thank you very much, Elena and Liam, for organizing this. I hope there were some ideas being thrown out which can be used. Can I just say a last thing about the writing of this book very quickly? It was written in 3 months flat, largely because I was taking some kind of, I don't know what to describe it as, but something that enabled me to sleep every night properly. So I'd wake up early, and then I'd be roaring to go by about 7:30, and I'd write till about 11 or 12, and I did this for 3 months consistently. But the research that I drew upon is staggered over years and years, going back to things that I was reading as a student in JNU back in the mid-70s. Like, my reference to Krishna Bharadwaj's work, or my reference to Shogata Mukherjee. All of that was stuff that I wrote, that I read in the 1970s as a student working in the Center for Historical Studies in JNU. So what I did was I would always keep notebooks, and over the years, these notebooks have got, the pile of notebooks has got bigger and bigger and bigger. So whenever I want to consult something, I just go back to an earlier notebook and I draw the reference out of it. For young researchers, young historical materialists, the key thing, the one tip I would like to give you is never use one library alone. Always move around between libraries. That's the only way you can become a historical materialist. Because if you specialize in one library, then you specialize in one perspective on the world, all right? So if we're talking about LSE, for example, or SOAS, for example, or the British Library, for example, or Senate House, always move around between libraries because you'll never be able to find everything in one library. That's my small tip to young historical materialists. Okay.
Thank you. That's amazing. We also had a bit of the ethnography of the book. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was, as predicted, an amazingly stimulating event. It was stimulating to read your book, to discuss among us, and to have feedback from you and further comments from Henry and Fahad. Thank you all for attending. And I think we can conclude it.
So can I just ask, is there a way of putting all the comments that people have sent in together and just circulating that maybe to some of us? Is that possible?
The plan is to upload the talk on, so it will be available for public consumption.
Right.
I can download the chat and send that to you, Jairus.
Yeah, the chat messages. It's possible to get that, yeah?
Yeah, I can do that.
Well,
you will do that.
All. Thank you very much. Thanks, Henry, and thanks, Fahad.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye to everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Liam. Bye, Elena.